SEP Readings presents Deep, Deeply by Anonymous. Part 1. After 9 isolated months in Azkaban, the world turned cold. The damp cell engraved itself onto Draco. Skin once softened by expensive elixirs was chafed and dry. Fair hands calloused. His face camouflaged itself against stone walls, and yet the most prominent change happened in his mind. He'd once easily accessed the parts of him that felt familiar. His sarcasm, wit, and charm had never been far from reach, but his greedy fingers paralyzed over time. Grasping for himself in the dark required energy he didn't have. Searching for warm thoughts behind layers of gelid rock became a battle he lost every time, and so he accepted silence as his companion instead. Every second lost to the dark, to the cold, he wore them like new limbs. Dead limbs which dragged behind him as he walked. Unsteady legs held him upright, but struggled against the added weight. He was starved, and yet felt heavier than ever. Draco hadn't realized how drastic the changes in him were until he was freed. He was incarcerated in November. Ice coated the iron bars. Winter winds broke through the cracks in the stone. Throughout the long nights, his body curled in on itself under the single thin blanket he'd been supplied with. Every attempt to warm himself cost more stamina than he had to exude. And so, when he was released during late July of 1999, Draco expected sun. He sought the warmth and humidity that only the dog days could provide. He missed the sheen of sweat and the floral scent of summer. He quickly learned it was foolish to want, to need, to have. For when Draco stepped onto the rocky shores of the North Sea surrounding the prison, there was no sun. The sky was an endless span of gray, and it was cold. Ocean mist soaked through his uniform, chilling him from the inside out. Narcissa had wrapped him in a large blanket before his final ministry hearing, but no added amount of layers stopped his teeth from chattering. The days that followed were much the same, cold, damp, and gray. Over every hill in Wiltshire. Draco wondered if Azkaban robbed him entirely of warmth. Perhaps his body could no longer feel or find the sensation. His mind tarnished in isolation, and now he surrounded himself with prison walls wherever he went. A seat by the fire, the embers would die out. Rays of sun shining in through the manor windows, until he stepped up to the sill. His mind was lost. His person was altered, and after 4 weeks freed, Draco learned whoever he'd become was unrecognizable. Azkaban forced him into anonymity. He could have been grateful, but all he felt was another weight of his persistent deprivation. Another loss. The Daily Prophet was interviewing Minister Kingsley Shacklebolt in the atrium. Dressed in simple black slacks and a blue jumper, Draco slipped past photographers who didn't spare him a second glance. He wove through onlookers and ministry staff. He remembered the articles, the ones asking about how he was and what he was doing. He was in front of them now. Their questions were in reach, but every step toward the lifts veiled Draco tighter in cellophane. The veil held even as the lift gates parted. The single occupant looked up before sliding over to make room, but Draco had frozen in the doorway. A single hand reached out to catch the gate before it could close. Granger. The whisper fell from his lips. Her eyes, which had since traveled elsewhere, returned to find his face. Granger's confusion was evident, her brows pinched, head tilted, as she tried to place him. Her lips parted and wavered in thought. The lift dinged, reminding Draco to move. He slipped between the doors, and they closed swiftly behind him. That's when he saw Granger's face shift. The uncertainty morphed into shock, and her shaking jaw all but dropped. Draco distanced himself from her entirely then, his back bruised into the cold metal walls. He held his breath. Malfoy? He heard the question in her voice. He knew how he looked, or rather, how he didn't. His head had been shaved in Azkaban. Where he'd once had layers of white blonde hair, now there was only a half-inch of patchy new growth. The blue in his irises had darkened entirely to gray. The skin beneath his eyes was bruised and purple. His entire face was a patchwork of healing scars and abrasions left by coarse stone that he hadn't the energy to glamour away. Draco Malfoy was not the same. Draco Malfoy was cold and displaced. He watched her risk a tentative side glance. He politely held his attention at the closed doors in front of him. "You work here now?" he asked. The formal robes. It was probably obvious, but his curiosity won out. "I'm interning with the International Law until Hogwarts reopens in May." Politeness was forgotten when he addressed her fully, his whole body turning to face her. The steady frown he wore goaded her on. "The continuing education program," she explained. "Will you be joining?" "Hadn't heard of it." Draco shrugged and looked away. "It's an accelerated course structure for those of us who were meant to graduate 98-99. Full-time students won't return until next autumn. Of course, you can jump right to the exams if you'd like, but I want to end my schooling properly." Draco nodded mindlessly, thankful when the doors before them parted. He and Granger moved to step through at the same time. He held back and allowed her to go first, motioning with his hand. Granger surprised him by hesitating near the lift. She turned to walk away, but was suddenly facing him again. "What are you doing here?" she asked, not quite meeting his eyes. He couldn't blame her. His face was no longer one worth lingering on. "I have a meeting with my probation counselor." "I see," she hummed and rocked on her heels. The interaction had Draco growing tense. His hands flexed and he hid them behind his back. "Granger." He stared at his feet. "I'm glad you're all right." Draco had slipped between her and the wall, moving toward the first row of offices, when her voice stopped him in his tracks. "You should consider it," she said. He stopped, finding Granger over his shoulder. "The program at Hogwarts next year. You should consider it," she reiterated. His lips pursed and eyes lowered. He ground his teeth, causing his jaw to ache. Draco didn't reply. Instead, he put his back to her entirely before stalking off to his appointment. In an unfortunate turn of events, which evidently were the only types of events Draco experienced as of late, he was informed he'd be returning to Hogwarts in the year 2000. There were 2 conditions to regaining his wand. They were established by Draco's probation advocate. The first being, he'd attend weekly sessions with a mind healer. This Draco expected. The second condition would require Draco to participate in the accelerated program at Hogwarts and complete his NEWTs. After graduation, he'd be free from ministry obligation and could return to a full life as a free wizard. The truth of the matter was, regardless of his achievements, Draco would never return to anything. There was no home. There were no friends, and far fewer opportunities. "You should look into finding yourself a tutor," Narcissa said to him one morning over breakfast. It was September now, still cold, still damp. He felt the discomfort burrow deep in his bones. Draco spent his days hidden in the manor's library or in his room. "What for?" he mumbled in response. "The ministry will only release you from the terms of your probation if you pass your exams." A needless reminder, but he acknowledged it with a nod. "I've never struggled with my studies before." "You also haven't stepped foot in a classroom in 2 years, Draco. I'd accept any additional support you could find," she urged. The only aspect of his life that remained consistent, both before and after Azkaban, was that Draco would do anything to please his mother. He stood from the table, setting the serviette down beside his plate. "I'll look into it," he said before leaving the room. It wasn't until a week later Draco finally obliged his mother's wishes. He was stuck in the purgatory between punishment and freedom. With that came a new form of boredom he hadn't experienced before. In Azkaban, he could afford to allow his mind to spiral. He learned to love the dark places he sent his thoughts. But when he returned to Wiltshire, Draco grew fearful of the darkness. He wedged himself under layers of distractions. Books and cleaning, reorganizing and clearing out rubbish. It was only when the distractions failed that the thoughts came thundering back in. During one particularly low moment, Draco found himself combing through classified section of the Daily Prophet. There were many services for hire, but only one that stood out to him. Advanced Studies Tutor needed, potions and herbology. Payment up front or knowledge trade. Listing by H. Granger. He was absolute shite in herbology, but his potion skills neared mastery level. In another life, he would have considered opening his own apothecary. And while he didn't have all the resources needed, Draco did have a way to fill the gap. His mother excelled in herbology at Hogwarts, and had made it a point over the years to stay well informed. She had her greenhouse, and there was an entire section in their library dedicated to the subject. It could work. It would work, but with one glaring complication. Draco was confined to the manor, the same manor Granger was imprisoned and tortured in. Avoiding the drawing room was one thought, but the request was still rancid with selfish desire. "You could submit a request to your advocate for permission to attend tutoring sessions off-grounds," Narcissa suggested after Draco explained his dilemma. To her defense, Narcissa appeared remorseful when he spoke about Granger. There was the flicker of sadness that darkened her blue eyes, and the way she turned from his stare. "In the meantime, you're both free to peruse my collection. Miss Granger can take with her whatever she needs, and if she is comfortable, I'd be happy to go over the 6th and 7th year requirements for you both." Draco winced at the thought, but carefully hid his reaction from her. Despite the internal debate, he found himself writing to Granger that same night. "Granger, I hope this letter finds you well. I'd like to offer a knowledge trade prior to the start of the CEP. While my strengths lie in potion-making, my mother has offered full access to her library, and is an excellent herbologist. As it would be unfair to have you come to the manor, I've put in a request with the Ministry for permission to leave the grounds. Until their response, you're free to borrow my class notes and any resources at my disposal. I'd understand if this arrangement is too painful for you to accept. D.M." Granger's response was delivered by Owl the following morning, and it included the date and time for their first session. Typical Gryffindor, she voiced no concerns about returning to the manor. Draco was surprised by that. He'd expected Granger to disregard his letter entirely. He thought she might laugh about it over tea with Potter and Weasley. Maybe she'd send a howler, or perhaps hex him before his next ministry date. It's what he deserved, after all. Instead, with all her bravery intact, she'd agreed to come to him. Draco briefly found himself wishing for his own dose of red courage. Green ambition had kept him alive, but it left him with very little to live for. His own return to the manor had been difficult. He was trapped in a place he hated. Every room held memories he'd pay to forget, and because of that, his mental state descended a little further into the shadows every day. The manor was lonely, as isolating as Azkaban. He rarely slept, and when he did, he was reawakened by the cold that seeped into every pore. He did his best to armor himself against it. Trousers lined with fleece, a long-sleeved shirt paired with a cardigan, a final jumper on top, billowing scarves and extra socks, blankets by the fire, full winter robes for walks in the sunshine. Any number of layers was rendered useless. The deep, glacial numbness slithered inside, encapsulating his bones in ice. This made Draco more grateful for Granger and her relentless courage. They would be a welcome distraction from the cold and the nothingness he'd surrounded himself with. She would add variety to his mundane schedule, filling his void with studies and purpose. But if Draco were desperate for anything most, it would be to feel something familiar again. He hoped Granger's hatred of him could be just that. Despite how hopeful he'd wanted to be, Draco felt nothing. On the evening of September the 29th, he waited in the flue parlor, a perfect picture of disassociation. When the flames flickered in the hearth, his eyes merely blinked. When Granger stepped through into the room, he didn't react, and when she approached him, Draco barely managed a nod in greeting. "Aren't you melting under all those layers?" Granger followed Draco through the manor the long way around. He sought to avoid the drawing room at its wing entirely. "I'm cold," he told her, straightening his cardigan over his chest. "Cold? It's 26 degrees in autumn. It's terrifying." "It's cold in here, then," he said. She was silent for a beat, maybe two. "Your hair's grown back." An indignant noise escaped his throat. "Well spotted, Granger." The cold delivery silenced her anxious chatter. The two moved into the library. She dawdled, glancing around the vast room in awe, while Draco took a seat at the workstation he'd set up in front of the fire. "You really are cold." Granger eyed the flames. orange reflected in her deep brown irises. He turned away from her, saying nothing as she arranged herself across from him. He could feel her stare, but refused to look up. "Did your mum put you up to this?" Granger asked. He frowned, attention holding to the parchment in front of him. "To finding a tutor, yes. To said tutor being you, no. I decided that for myself." "You look like you're in pain," she said. "I'm uncomfortable," he deadpanned. "I didn't want you to have to come back here." "I offered." Draco pushed his potions notes across the table. He'd put asterisks next to their focus areas for their NEWTs. "I'm afraid I'm out of practice," Granger said, chewing on her lip. "It's been a while since I found my way to a lab." "Today we'll review foundation work. During next week's session, we can put those to use." She nodded and thumbed through Draco's notes. He'd been meticulous when redrafting them. He'd gone through each version of potions textbook required by the school dating back to 1750. He pulled out every brew in history that wound up on the exam, highlighting the dates and questions asked. "Those are yours," he told her. "You could keep them. Use them to study." "You've done all this for me?" Seeing her eyes widen, Draco shrugged. Her head tilted as she stared. He could see her ever-persistent mind whirling with thoughts, while she traced his face and carefully muted expression. "Which areas would you like help in?" she asked. "Any. A general refresher will do." Her posture stiffened and she frowned. "That hardly seems fair." Draco snorted. "Those were my conditions," she said. "A knowledge transfer." He lowered his eyes. "At the end of the day, your scores are worth more than mine. Best to put our time and energy where it's needed." She didn't respond, but her glare did darken. Draco ignored it and conjured a stack of blank parchment. "Let's begin with years 1 through 5 as a review. I'll name the ailment, and you provide the potion." They met once a week for the first month. She'd grown visibly frustrated with their dynamic. Undeterred, Draco never offered an opportunity for her to complain. He kept her busy. Between practical work in his potions lab and rapid-fire questionnaires, he was a most thorough tutor. Until the first week of November. Draco had slipped further into his solemn state, and Granger was uncharacteristically unfocused. Under any other circumstances, Draco would have found it humorous. Not here, though. Not at the manor. Here there was only Draco to fuel Granger's curiosities. Her prodding and incessant questioning had him grinding his teeth. He'd redirect and distract, but Hermione Granger was a stubborn sort of witch. "Draco, do you see anyone other than me and your mum and your advocate?" she asked, chewing on the butt of her muggle pen. "I go to my mind healer on Tuesday afternoons," he casually supplied. "That's not what I meant," Hermione frowned. "What about your friends from school?" "What about them?" he grumbled, pretending to find something fascinating in his text. "When's the last time you saw them?" He shut his book defiantly, pushed it away. "How is that any of your concern?" Hermione straightened. "It's not. I was only curious." She turned down to her notes, appearing wounded. Her shoulders curled inward and she worried on her lip. Draco sighed. He shouldn't make a habit out of coddling lions, but it was the only way to get their session back on track. "I haven't seen them since Hogwarts. I don't want to see them, and I don't want them to see me. Is that a suitable answer for you?" Offering him a small smile, she turned her head. "For any particular reason, or—" Her voice trailed off, prompting him to continue. Draco bit down on his cheek. He drew in a short breath. "I'm not the same person. It wouldn't work." Her head tilted back the other way. "You spend time with me, though." "We have an arrangement," he glared. "Besides, you didn't know me before. Not really, anyway." He tapped a finger against her parchment. "Get back to work." She dropped her eyes. After a moment, she began to fidget, adjusting in her seat and rearranging her stationery. "What is it, Granger?" He leaned forward, tight fists over the table. "Your mother," she said. His eyes rolled. "What about her?" She's done all this work for us. The outlines, the practice exams." "The question, Granger, get to it," he glowered. Where is she?" Draco tore a hand through his hair and down his face. "She's around." Another 4 weeks went by, leading them into December. Draco was impressed with himself. He'd maintained full control over his and Granger's study sessions, and she was effortlessly swayed from getting too close or too personal. And Draco was grateful for that. Because closing in on the holidays was difficult for him. The weather was frigid and all too reminiscent of his prison cell. His mother was lonely. Her own deteriorating mental health could no longer be ignored, and while Draco was grateful for the continued distance from his father, he felt guilt. It felt wrong to feel relief while his mother edged closer to depression. The pending holiday season was void of any wonder, of any joy. The loss managed to separate Draco further from the person he used to be, the boy who loved presents and festive treats. He soured without them. His outward personality turned bitter, and because of that, he wasn't surprised when Granger announced she wanted to take a few weeks off. She'd entered the flu parlor on December the 2nd, a force to be reckoned with. She usually followed Draco to the library, but on that evening she took the lead. "We're reviewing Roan's coursework today," she told him. There was a bit of a stomp to her step. "If that's what you'd like," he said casually. Granger turned on him. Hands on her hips in the dimly lit corridor, she glared. "That is what I'd like, but the real question is, what do you want, Draco?" He felt his brows flicker in confusion. "I'm here every Thursday," she continued. "I walk into that library and you've got an entire curriculum planned. Potions work, herbology, charms. This is supposed to be a partnership. I'm meant to be helping you as much as you're helping me." Draco shrugged, burying his hands in his outer robes. "It's helping." "Gods, Draco, where are you?" she asked. "This isn't you. Fight back." With that, he stepped around her. He threw open the double doors and stalked toward their table. Draco could feel her stare as he sat with his back to her. He could hear her soft footfalls when she approached. Granger took the chair to the right of him. "I'm sorry," she huffed. He said nothing, his attention fixed to the hands he clasped over the table. She sighed. "This dynamic makes me feel like I'm taking advantage of you, of your mother and all your resources." His lips pursed. "It's fine, Granger. We can start ancient runes today." She was silent for a time. In his peripheral vision, Granger was still watching him closely. She had the butt of her pen between her teeth, and a worry line creased between her eyes. "I'm going to take a few weeks off." She looked away. "For the holidays," Granger corrected. "We both need a break, and we've had a good head start. We'll reconvene in January." Draco nodded idly in agreement. She waited a full minute before her hands came down, grasping her thighs in one long, aggressive stroke. "Is there anything you have to say to that?" He was calm, his breathing even. "I'll send you home with the textbooks my mother pulled for you." She shook her head, lips parted. "There's no need. She owed them to me this morning." That had his full attention. His eyes honed in on her. "You've been in contact with my mother?" Her cheeks tinged pink. "Only for the last few days. She apologized for her part in the war, and I thanked her for her help in herbology." Draco didn't respond, but he felt something boiling beneath his skin. Something he'd forgotten. It felt like rage, like betrayal. "We're worried about you," she whispered. He stiffened, burrowing further into his robes. A sudden chill banished his rage entirely, and Draco wondered which sensation he would have preferred. The cold was familiar now, but rage was an old friend, one he hadn't heard from in a while. "Start your lecture, Granger," he said, shaking his head to clear his thoughts. She sighed. Granger ran a hand over her right forearm. "Very well, then." Narcissa and Draco survived the New Year without fanfare. They didn't celebrate. The holidays came and went like ordinary days, and his weeks without study sessions dragged on. And yet, Hermione had been right. The reprieve was nice. Without the anticipation of her visits, Draco's anxiety declined. He returned to his mundane pattern of post-Azkaban life. The hours and seconds blended together. He slept and woke and ate, and the minutes in between he filled with books. During days without Granger, he didn't need to worry about how to evade her questions. He wasn't troubled by her unexpectedly soft expression. She wasn't there, making him uneasy by being uncharacteristically kind. 5 days out from Granger's return, however, those anxieties began to seep back in. "I'm going to stop my study sessions," he told his healer. Healer Murphy, a middle-aged wizard with dark hair and glasses, conjured his quick quill. "I see. And do you feel confident in your decision?" Draco shrugged, his head tilting insincerely. Healer Murphy nodded as his green eyes studied Draco intently. "What will you do to fill your time instead?" he asked. "I've hired a private tutor to start in mid-February. That should be an adequate amount of time before summer courses begin." "And have you told Miss Granger that you intend to discontinue your arrangement?" Draco turned his attention to the window. "I'll write her this evening." Healer Murphy hummed. "So long as this is a rational decision you're making, you do what you feel is best for you, Draco." Draco wondered if it was as simple as that, and if so, would Granger be as receptive as his healer had been? The answer was no. It was well after 9 on the first Tuesday in January when Draco's bedroom door was thrown open. An angry and red-faced Hermione Granger stormed into the dimly lit room. She held his letter high, waving it as she approached him. "What's this?" she demanded. She was standing at the edge of his bed, looking down at him. Draco propped his book open against his chest and regarded her slowly. "That wasn't meant to offend you," he explained. Granger shook her head, silencing him. "No, of course it wasn't, but it did." Digging his heels into the mattress, Draco drew back against the headboard. "This isn't about you. We're meant to go our separate ways eventually. Or did you really expect the two of us to continue our arrangement at Hogwarts?" "Yes," she answered quickly. "I thought that's exactly what we would do." He folded his hands, idly twisting his ring around his finger. "I can't have you associated with me, Granger. The reaction that would cause." "You're embarrassed to be seen with me." He reeled back, a single brow arched in surprise. That had to be the dumbest question he'd ever heard uttered, and from Britain's brightest witch of all people. "What? No, of course not." Draco watched Granger's chest recede in a long exhale. "I'm concerned for your sake, not mine," he said. "Hanging around me, it's not a good idea." Granger rolled her eyes. She sat at the edge of the bed beside his knees. She had no boundaries. This witch, it was irritating. Something lurched in his chest at the sensation. Irritation. He was irritated. As her hip brushed his legs, he wasn't cold. He was angry. "We're all adults now, Draco. It's not the same as it was. You'd know that if you left the manor more often," she said. "Why do you care? You haven't been here in a month. I figured you'd be glad for the time back." His jaw clenched as he stared at her down his nose. "You were working too hard. You made a career out of our sessions with your lesson plans and questionnaires. You needed a break." "I'm on a break," he snapped, "until February when my new tutor starts." She crossed her arms, sitting taller. Granger's fiery temper rolled off of her in waves. "Is that what you want? A new tutor?" Draco didn't respond. "You wrote me, Draco. You saw my listing and you were free to ignore it, but it was you who wrote to me." Again, he stayed silent. Granger flushed, her cheeks darkening. He watched her thoughts succumb to the mental calisthenics that she was so often prone to. She returned to her feet with fists drawn tight at her sides. "Why did you respond to my listing? And Merlin give me strength. You better answer." His hands raised in surrender. "It fit, that's all." "Elaborate, Malfoy." Draco sighed. His hands clamped down on his knees to the point of pain. "You saw me at the ministry that day. You were uncomfortable, but you weren't afraid. If you turned me down, I would have expected it." Something akin to understanding flashed through her eyes. He didn't let her thought take root. "Money still talks, Granger. But you've looked at me the same way for almost 9 years. You were predictable, until you weren't." Head tilting, her lips parted and her brow twitched. "You expected me to come here and be cruel to you." "It would have been easier if you had. That's what I would have done. he mumbled. She snorted before crossing her arms. And because I treated you with respect, you're asking me to leave. More silence. Words failed him. He'd once had retorts cued and ready for fire. Now, when he searched his mind for something to say, it took effort and energy he didn't have. Granger reached into her long winter robes. She retrieved a small parcel and threw it in his lap. With a quick wave of her wand, it enlarged. Happy belated Christmas, Malfoy. Owl me when you're ready to talk. Draco stared at the vacant spot Granger had occupied long after she disappeared. It was easier for him to believe that this was the right thing to do. His darkness was toxic. He was cold in the same places where she had warmth. Granger's resilience and light only drew more attention to the pieces of him he'd lost. He'd drag her down. He'd run her ragged with coursework and distractions, continuing their arrangement with selfishness in its purest form. But when he opened her gift, regret flooded in. To keep you warm, the card said. He pulled the lid from the parcel. Folded inside, Draco revealed a cream-colored jumper. It was cashmere, and it warmed his hands as he clutched the jumper against his chest. Lifting the soft fabric up to his nose, he inhaled deeply. It smelled the way summer felt, warm and floral. The aroma reminded him of summer spent in France and the start of term at Hogwarts. It smelt like home. More surprisingly, it smelt like Granger. The next time Draco walked into his healer's office, he wasn't driven by fear. He felt a tiny spark of energy, of warmth. He sat across from Healer Murphy, wearing his new jumper and sitting up straight. I'm ready, he announced. For what, Draco? The healer responded. To find my missing pieces.